Time now for the Executive Edge, and we are learning from China what life after the pandemic may look like. Eunice Yoon was under lockdown, bringing us critical reporting from Beijing from January through May, and first traveled outside the city earlier this week for a report from Shanghai. She joins us now to talk about the changes in daily life that we may soon be seeing in America. And Eunice, I was following pretty closely a lot of stuff that you were tweeting just about how you got on the train, how they were taking people's temperatures, what happened on the plane. And I have to admit, I'm watching all of this thinking, OK, is this what it's going to look like for us? What to you was the most shocking thing, the most surprising thing, and maybe what made you feel most comforted?
I think that just the whole idea of getting out and then, was a little bit anxiety ridden. I mean, I was quite nervous about coming out just because we had been under lockdown here for 4 months. But it did feel good to finally see something new. And traveling has changed. I mean, as you had noted, the temperature checks, there's thermal imaging right when you walk into the airport or when you walk into the train station. And then for the airport, I ended up getting my temperature checked 5 times. So I had to get my temperature checked when I walked in at the security gate, and then again at the gate and on my wrist, and then at the plane door on my forehead. So there's a lot of screening that takes place. Also, everybody has to wear a mask. The only time when I was allowed to take my mask off was when the security asked to ID me, and then also when I went through the metal detector. So they want to make sure that there's nothing hidden underneath your mask. Then, of course, everybody has to wear PPE. So all the ground staff, the airline staff, everyone has at least a mask. Some people wear goggles, protective shields. The people who were handling all the temperature screening all had full-on hazmat suits, which you might think would be surprising, but at this point now in China is not really shocking at all. What was interesting, though, to me was that there wasn't a whole lot of social distancing on the planes or in the trains, and because the tickets now are all being sold. So in the past, the railways and the airport authorities were trying to limit the number of seats that would be sold to make sure that there would be like alternate seating in all the carts. But that no longer is the case. In the trains, also what was interesting was that if you do have a temperature, there is now an area where they want to quarantine you. So you would go in between the cars and stand there for the rest of your journey. But then they would ask you if you could please leave a little bit earlier than your final destination because they want to make sure that there aren't any people who have fevers on the train. And then finally, also, one other thing that was interesting that happened just today, I've been hearing a lot now from various factories and people working in companies that the authorities here are talking about easing the travel entry ban for foreign executives. So as you guys know, the foreign executives, including foreign residents, have been banned from returning to China. But now it looks as though the wheels are in motion to try to allow people to come in. There's been a lot of speculation that it could happen after the National People's Congress, which is next week, and sometime in June, but that as a foreign executive, you would have to have a letter from your company vouching that you are a critical employee. And in some cases, having another letter that vouches that you are healthy, so that legally you are tied to that company. And then secondly, once you come in, you would have to expect a 14-day quarantine. And so if you are a foreign resident, you would go to your home and they're literally going to put police tape on your door to make sure that you do not come out. And then if you are not a resident in China, then you would be funneled to centralized quarantine or a government-appointed hotel. And that could not necessarily be in a city like Beijing or Shanghai, but more likely in Inner Mongolia or someplace else before you're allowed into one of the big cities. And so there are a lot of now changes that are taking place to try to make it a little bit easier for people who are coming from a lower countries that have a lower infection risk into China, who are seen as critical. But when I asked people, do you think Americans will be allowed anytime soon? Most people don't think that is the case because of the infection risk level in the United States right now.
I mean, Eunice, a lot of the things that you just described, I could see happening here. Things like temperature checks, requiring people to wear masks. But the idea that anybody who flies into JFK from some other country is going to be told that they have to self-quarantine in North Dakota or something. I don't see that happening in America. Maybe they ask you to stay and self-quarantine. I don't even know that we would set up hotels and say, okay, you have to stay here at the JFK hotel or something for 14 days. Those are things that I think China has had a much easier time, because it's an authoritarian government, with saying you're going to do these things. I don't know that that translates here.
Yeah, and then also you have to pay for it yourself. You have to pay about $120 a day in order to, for that a government-appointed hotel in Inner Mongolia. However, the other thing, though, that I think is a big difference between the U.S. and China is the government-mandated health code and this travel itinerary that generates a barcode from your mobile phone just because of privacy issues. Here in China, everybody has to use them. And it's unclear exactly what data is collected, whether or not it's synced up to your medical records. All of this stuff is a big question mark here, and I don't necessarily see that as something that Americans will really accept. But it's something that's very prevalent here. I mean, that's part of the basics. Right now, we have registration of ID, temperature checks, the health code, the travel itinerary that's generated on your mobile phone that creates a barcode. And then there's some things that, in terms of where we are in China, that are some things to watch. Like, one is that our sports venues here are now open. They require reservations. So if you want to go to a stadium, or if you want to go someplace outdoors where you could go jogging, you have to register. And so they want to limit the number of people who are there. Some contact sports are still not allowed. It's moved up a little bit, where they said that you could play basketball, for example. If you're outside, you cannot play basketball. If you are indoors, you can play ping pong, because that's social distanced from the Chinese perspective. In gyms right now, no swimming is allowed, no underground gyms, but you can now have some cardio machines, whereas before there was a serious limitation on the kind of exercises that you could do at the gym. For restaurants here, something that's kind of specific for China, all the restaurants now are open, but the authorities are encouraging people to use serving utensils, and for people to eat out with their own plates. And that's a cultural difference in China, because in China, most people share this, eat everything family style with a shared dish. And then finally, what we're watching is the theaters, because new guidelines just came out in Shanghai that where we're anticipating a push to open the cinemas in June. And one of the requirements is that people will have to have alternate seating and alternate rows. So that doesn't necessarily mean there's going to be a lot of people watching the movies, but hopefully they'll be open to some. Although one thing that was kind of entertaining is that some people in the film industry said that there aren't any good movies right now in China to screen, so that could be another big issue to get people in.